This is the Bad Mothers Podcast, where we dive deep into our maternal urges, or lack thereof. We talk about the mothers we left or who left us, and whether they haunt our own choices about having children. This episode is a bit different, which is why I'm calling it a bonus. It's a much shorter interview, and it's with an academic scholar, Gaddini, who studies conservative Christian women and abortion rights. I hope you enjoy it. I'll just kick us off with a little bit of context about why I wanted to speak to Katie. Since I started this podcast, I've heard from lots of women who tell me they're struggling with their relationships with their mothers, or have cut off contact but are still suffering from the abuse they endured for their whole lives. Nobody has told me they cut off contact because of a religious or political disagreement. Still, that's what we tend to read about in the media when they do write about estrangement. And I'm sure there are plenty of examples of breaks occurring because of religion and politics. As conservatives become more entrenched with Trump and progressives despair over practically everything he does, the gulf between us widens. If that gulf exists in a family, it gets complicated. And if that gulf exists in a family that lacks respect or consideration for any member, it might become the straw that broke the camel's back. Trump has said many times, and most recently in his joint session address, that he was saved by God from an assassination attempt last year, so that he could, quote, make America great again. Plenty of his supporters have voiced the same opinion. These people believe, somehow, in spite of his poor treatment of many, many, many people, Trump is a good Christian. There's a meme that makes me laugh every time I see it. It says, "It's so weird being raised by Christians and spending your entire childhood being told to care about others. Then one day they're just like, you're not actually supposed to care about others, you stupid socialist." I think it's something a lot of lefties who come from conservative households can relate to. We're told to help those less fortunate than ourselves, but when we vote for politicians who want to offer that support as part of our government, we're called stupid socialists. My bio says that I'm from Washington, D.C., and that's true. It's the first place I remember living and the last place I lived before moving to the UK. But for a good chunk in the middle, from about age 13 to 22, I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where everyone goes to the high school football game on Friday and to church on Sunday. My parents took us to church occasionally before our time in Pennsylvania, but when we moved there with our mother following our parents' divorce, my mom decided we would be dedicated Catholics. That is, my sisters and I would be. She didn't go to church as consistently as we had to. And I noticed almost instantly that I saw people in church who were not very nice to me in school. And there were a lot of people who were not very nice to me and my sisters because we had a funny last name and we weren't quite white enough to fit in. We'd come from a pretty urban place where we saw many different cultures and races every day and landed in a very conservative, Catholic, culturally distinct place. My mother started buying pasta from a woman who boxed it up in her house. I had to get my first Holy Communion at age 13. I towered over all the other kids. And even though I was told that a handful of the girls in my grade were my cousins, none of them acknowledged me. And we were Republican. We were so Republican that I didn't really even understand there was another political party until well into my teens. According to my neighbors, the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky story was the worst thing that could have happened to America. Yet the old men who lined the counter at the diner where I worked loved making jokes about my name. And so that sort of experience conditioned me to think of conservatism as an overlapping religious and political ideology. It took me a while to unpick this, but I did. I know Catholics who are politically liberal and atheists who are politically conservative. I love and respect many people of varying degrees of faith and across the political spectrum. And I think it's an unfair characterization to say that all Christian conservatives want to take away women's rights. But Republicans did decide to harness conservative Christians' votes. Abortion was embraced as a political wedge issue after Roe v. Wade. In the late 70s, the so-called moral majority was founded by a Baptist minister, Jerry Falwell, and he helped turn a huge swath of non-voting Christians into Republicans in a bid to end abortion, which I think is a big reason Trump won twice. Abortion is now widely restricted, with many states pushing the boundaries even further. Some are even proposing measures that make abortion murder punishable with the death penalty, and we've seen moves to actually restrict women's movements. According to the brilliant Jessica Valenti, who tracks abortion legislation in her newsletter, Abortion Every Day, House Bill 609, which has thankfully now been tabled, would criminalize anyone who leaves Montana to obtain an abortion that would be illegal within the state. Since Montana is one of the states where you can't have an abortion after viability unless the pregnant person's life is at risk, that means a woman who goes to another state for an abortion after viability would be considered to be trafficking her fetus. She might be going to another state because she just doesn't want to have a baby and couldn't find an appointment for an abortion sooner. Or maybe she found out her fetus has a fatal abnormality and understandably doesn't want to carry the pregnancy to term only to watch her newborn die. Either way, Republicans in the state want to make it against the law for her to leave the state. Let that sink in. Now, the SAVE Act, which would severely curtail the votes of married women across the country, can also be seen as a policy derived from religious practice. It's a measure that claims to protect against illegal voting by non-citizens, but in practice it would make it very difficult and expensive for many women to vote, because they would need to present a birth certificate or passport with their legal name, which is a tricky thing for women who've taken their husbands' names. Sure, you can get a new passport, but that's time-consuming and expensive. Sarah Stankorb reported on this for the New Republic, and she explains that in many conservative Christian households, it's understood that the man is in charge. He tells the family how to vote, and any wife who votes counter to his wishes is doing something very wrong. Stankorb wrote, "Just as Christian nationalist ideals have seeped into our laws and discourse, ideals from its companion worldview, Christian patriarchy, have set the groundwork for women's voter suppression through the church. I don't have an interest in getting involved in the religion or politics or life choices of any woman so long as she chooses them freely. That's literally the entire premise of Bad Mothers. But what concerns me is that politicians are again taking a personal, religion-based idea, like the belief that abortion is a moral wrong, determining it to be useful politics for them, and engaging a religious group to vote for it to be the law of the entire country, essentially dictating the freedom and choices that I have in my life." Dr. Katie Gaddini is a visiting scholar at Stanford University, an associate professor of sociology at the Social Research Institute, UCL, and a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. From 2022 to 2026, she's a United Kingdom Research and Innovation Research Fellow at Stanford University and UCL. Her debut book, The Struggle to Stay, was based on over 4 years of in-depth ethnographic research with single evangelical women in the US and the UK. She's currently writing a book on Christian women and conservative politics from 1970 to the present. Her writing has been published all over, including the San Francisco Chronicle, The Hill, and LA Review of Books. Katie holds master's degrees from Boston College and the London School of Economics and a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge. Now, here's my interview with Dr. Katie Gaddini. So your research is, or appears to be, razor focused on Christian women, including Catholics, evangelicals, mainline Protestants, and the resulting gender politics. So I'd like for you to maybe tell us a bit more about how you came to the topic and your background, which I know you address a bit in your first book, The Struggle to Stay. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I grew up evangelical in a large religious conservative family in California. And I decided later for my PhD to study women within evangelicalism, specifically because in a lot of evangelical traditions, they endorse women having leadership roles. But women are never really in those roles. So that was something I wanted to look at, as well as the effects on women who are feminist, who maybe don't fit the mold of what an ideal Christian woman looks like in terms of their personality or their life choices, and how do they make sense of their faith and their belonging to religious communities when they are kind of outside the mold as women. And that led me to doing this current study, which started as looking at evangelical women supporting Trump. And this was in 2016 when Trump was the Republican nominee. And I flew back to the US to interview some women to see why they were voting for Trump and what interested them and how their faith impacted that. And then the study's really expanded since then to include Christian women from different denominations. So as you mentioned, Catholics and mainline Protestants, but keeping that focus on women and conservative politics, which has for the last 8 years meant support for Donald Trump.
We met as panelists for a discussion based in the UK about the US election and abortion rights, and that was back in October before the election took place. And at that time, you were embedded with Christians who were campaigning for Trump. So can you talk about what that work entailed and maybe a few key things that you learned from that experience?
Yeah, so I've been embedded with them, I'd say, for the last 4 years. So I started up again right before the 2020 election, interviewing women across the country. And then, I did rounds of interviews around the midterms, and really every political event that we've had over the last 4 years, I have been there with interviewing and attending events. And of course, the lead up to this election was a really busy time for me. So the last year I've spent going to rallies, going to marches, going, some of them are really big, like in DC, and then some of them are smaller, like town halls. I've also been going to a lot of church services, and doing constant text messages with these women. And this also meant canvassing with some women and a few men in Northern Virginia right before the election. It's really the kind of research I do is qualitative, but it's also in this study been long-term qualitative. And that's been really an important way of approaching it, because there have been so many events over the last few years. I'm thinking of the insurrection that happened and all the changes we saw with the campaign season. It's been really important to kind of track these women at every different event and every different stage in this changing, volatile political landscape, to get their immediate read on it, but also see how they are formulating their approach to different issues as politics and social conditions are changing. The pandemic is a really good example of that, where I saw some shifts in the way that women were approaching politics. And then I've seen a reshuffling since then, always in relation to different social and political larger movements that are happening.
And what changes did you see occurring, maybe from 2020 on? Because it seems to me, from my perspective, that the Republican Party became a lot more conservative around particular issues, mainly reproductive rights, or at least the restrictions became worse than they were before. I don't know if actually their ideas about it had changed, but when those restrictions became more strict, did you see a shift in the way the women you were meeting with thought about abortion rights and reproductive rights?
Yeah, so that's a really good issue to kind of focus on. There's such a long history in the U.S. of Christian conservatives really fighting to end abortion. And for a lot of people I met, who are not within these communities, they said, okay, they got Roe versus Wade overturned. They're done now. Like, are they satisfied? Are they resting? And actually what we saw was the opposite. So a lot of pro-life, as they call themselves, women that I've met, were really energized by that overturning, by the Dobbs decision, and really have started to move on to kind of a next tier set of priorities that they want to address that is related to abortion or reproductive rights. And the two areas that I see, primarily are limitations on IVF or fetal personhood for embryos. And then it's the restriction of mifepristone, which is a pill that people take when they're wanting to terminate early days, terminate a pregnancy, or if they're having a miscarriage and they need to clear the tissues out of their body. So it can really be a life-saving treatment. So I like to remind pro-choice activists that, when they say an abortion ban is coming, I think that's imminent. And I could be wrong. That could happen. But, in doing this research for 4 years with all different levels of pro-life activists, that hasn't been one of their priorities. But we see the shift, with the overturning of Roe in terms of where they're putting their energy now.
So would you say that Christian views on motherhood directly inform their opinions on abortion? Or would you say that conservative Christians' objection to abortion is strictly about fetal personhood, which then would lead to more restrictions with IVF, as you were saying?
I think there's a few different things going on. I'm actually writing a chapter right now in my book on the politics of motherhood and the ways that this motherhood identity mobilizes a lot of women to enter politics, but also allows them to remain unsuspected and kind of to reaffirm their status, not just as mothers, but as women, which is dictated by a lot of Christian norms. So that certainly, this Save the Children narrative, which runs across so many different political issues, is one of the drivers for women in wanting restrictions on abortion, which again, can stretch all the way from actual abortions to restricting birth control pills. But for other folks, there is this merging, their understanding of where life begins and where personhood begins, that isn't necessarily attached to the motherhood identity, or they've been able to strip it back. So there are different motivations, I think, for different people within this movement, but there's definitely a large contingent of the politics of motherhood driving it.
Bad Mothers is really about women who don't fit neatly into patriarchal structures, especially when it comes to womanhood or motherhood and womanhood. But other than what you just said about how being a mother sort of drives some of these conservative values, what else does it mean to be a mother in these really conservative circles? And I guess what happens with, have you met any women who don't want to be mothers?
No, is the short answer. Women that don't want to be mothers, or at least they don't say that they don't want to be mothers. I've interviewed young women from age 18 and they aspire to motherhood. That is like definitely part of the plan for their futures alongside anything else. That is a central plan. And when I was writing this chapter, actually, I was digging in some archival materials the other day and I came across a book that was written by Beverly LaHaye, who really spearheaded conservative women activism in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. She started a group called Concerned Women for America. And she wrote this chapter in one of her books that is called Women, and then it had a hyphen and it said Giver of Life. And I just thought, that was so simple and so succinct, but that kind of sums it up. And that idea has really persisted, is that women's role is to give life and to have children. And that has really stuck over, 55 years. That hasn't shifted, even though there's been so many other shifts with gender roles within conservative, right-wing Christian women. That one hasn't shifted. What has shifted is the way that women navigate being a mother alongside other roles they occupied, especially when it comes to work or political ambitions. And those negotiations have shifted alongside mainstream secular feminism. but the goal is always still to be a mother. And that can extend, I've met some women that have 6 children, and are homeschooling them and are doing kind of intensive mothering. And then I've met women that have 2 children. I don't know if I've met anyone with just one. So the way that carries out changes, but it's always the goal.
Interesting. So would you say then that that really the root of the resistance to abortion rights is because the woman's role is to be a mother, so of course, in these circles, it wouldn't make sense to not have a child if you already are pregnant, right?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it for a lot of women that are drawing on that maternal activism. And where they encounter a bind is actually with IVF. Really interestingly, we're seeing this come up is because, the conservative Christian message has been have kids, procreate, women's role is to be a mother. And yet, and IVF can help towards that. And yet at the same time, they're wanting to impose fetal personhood on embryos, personhood status on embryos. And so that would restrict IVF necessarily. So there's this kind of bind that a lot of conservatives and conservative women are facing around this issue. And it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, I think, over the next couple of years, especially under this incoming administration.
Yeah, for sure. What other women's rights do you see in conservative Christian sites? I thought maybe this would be an opportunity that you could share a bit about your paper on campus conservative groups and the gender roles that are evident there.
Yeah, so that paper really looks at these younger women, college age, which in the US, is university age women, and how they are getting involved in conservative activism. And that largely happens on a social media platform and kind of fulfilling these gendered roles of being sexy and being attractive and being white and middle class and being conservative, and kind of bringing all that together in this really stylized package that is then presented on social media. What's interesting is when you look at it from a historical perspective, a lot of right-wing women's activism started with opposing feminism in the 70s. And that was like their biggest goal, is just to say, we are the anti-feminist women. And then interestingly, over time, as I mentioned, feminism has seeped into even these conservative spaces. And now a lot of these conservative women are borrowing parts of feminism. So it's not a pure rejection or disavowal. There is some definite borrowing and reimagining, even at the same time as they would outwardly say, we're not feminists, but a lot of their language or their rhetoric or their practices even would be considered feminist. So I find that relationship really interesting, that kind of antagonistic relationship that conservative anti-feminist women have with feminism.
And as you wrote separately, they're borrowing parts of secular liberal feminism that endorse women, quote, having it all, and using a lot of girl power rhetoric, even though they reject feminism as a label. I find that really interesting. You mentioned you're working on a new book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm writing a book on 7 different types of right-wing Christian women, and it's historical and also based on my present-day research. So I kind of take you through from 1970 to the present. The majority of it is contemporary, but looking at kind of the roots for some of the women's participation in politics that we see today, and kind of how we got to this point where an overwhelming amount of white women in particular, and 95% of evangelical women, support someone like Donald Trump.
Big thank you to my guest, Dr. Katie Gaddini. I'll link in the show notes where you can find more about her writing, and her books. Bad Mothers is written, produced, and edited by me, Monica Cardenas. I'd love it if you'd rate and review the show and get in touch with any feedback. You can find me on my Substack, and guess what? It's called Bad Mothers too.